Unquestionably, Bridger's claims to remembrance rest upon the extraordinary part he bore in the explorations of the West. As a guide, he was without equal, and this is the testimony of everyone who knew him. He was a born topographer. The whole West was mapped out in his mind, and such was his instinctive sense of locality and direction that it used to be said of him that he could smell his way where he could not see it. He was a complete master of plains and woodcraft, equal to any emergency, full of resources to overcome any obstacles. And I came to learn gradually how it was that for months such men could live without food, except what the country afforded in that wild region. Bridger was not an educated man. Still, any country that he had ever seen, he could fully and intelligently describe, and he could make a very correct estimate of the country surrounding it. He could make a map of any country he had ever traveled over, mark out its streams and mountains and the obstacles in it correctly, so that there was no trouble in following it and fully understanding it. As a guide, I do not think he had his equal upon the plains. These quotes were delivered by none other than Grenville Dodge, a Union Army officer and intelligence chief for Ulysses S. Grant. And no other quote in history better summarizes the legendary exploits of Jim Bridger, the mountain man, expert explorer, and forefather of the American West. This is his story. James Felix Bridger was born on March 17, 1804, in the historic town of Richmond, Virginia. When he was only 8 years old, his father, a respectable surveyor and innkeeper in Old Dominion, moved the Bridger clan to the western border of Illinois. There, they ran a family farm just outside of St. Louis, where young Jim learned both the credence of hard work and love for adventure. In January of 1822, Bridger finally pulled the trigger on leaving home and beginning his westward journey. Bridger found an advertisement in the Missouri Republican to do just that, posted by the iconic Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The company requested 100 men journey with their fur traders and frontiersmen along the Missouri River and into the Rocky Mountains, where beaver traps were waiting to be laid. It offered $200 per year, although it wasn't as if Bridger needed the dough to be convinced. Bridger convened with General William Ashley, the founder of the company and first lieutenant governor of Missouri. He and his 99 other men kick-started the Upper Missouri Expedition on the Missouri River in March of that same year. They traded gunpowder with the local natives, a band of Arikara warriors, in exchange for 50 horses, and from there, the fur traders' fortunes faltered. A few months later, as summer came about, a fellow trapper in Ashley's party by the name of Aaron Stevens attempted to sleep with an Arikara woman. The young man's throat was slit, and the Arikara warriors descended on the trapper's campsite. Bridger escaped unscathed, and around 75 men were able to survive and push off upstream and retreat. They soon joined forces with Captain Andrew Henry and his 250 U.S. soldiers. Alongside hundreds of other warriors from various bands of Sioux, the collection of mountain men that included the likes of famous frontiersmen Hugh Glass, Jim Beckworth, and Jebediah Smith ventured back to the Arikara campsite and plundered their village, killing many of the Pawnee and sieging their supplies. It was weeks later that Hugh Glass's infamous encounter with a grizzly bear would enter his violence-filled folk life, as well as the likes of Jim Bridger. After switching allegiances to Captain Henry, Glass defied his command to remain with the camp and went berry picking by his lonesome. While foraging against orders, Glass was charged by the bear out of protection for her nearby twin cubs. He fired a shot with his .54 caliber Hawken rifle, but it did little to deter old Ephraim from tearing a chunk of flesh from his buttocks, tossing it to her cubs. After the bear continued to maul the fur trapper, with claw gashes in his back and bite marks across his face and neck, another shot rang out, and the grizzly fell over dead. It's unknown whether Glass fired the fatal shot himself, or one of the two hunters designated to find game showed up in the nick of time, one of which being none other than Jim Bridger. Regardless, the hunters alerted the rest of the party, and Glass was kept alive by torn pieces of cloth keeping his open wounds together. They carried him on a branch-built litter for a few days, before realizing their pace could no longer be slowed by the injured Glass. It's said that Captain Henry offered a couple $100 to any man who stayed with Glass until he died, and two trappers, one by the name of John Fitzgerald and a teenager named Bridges, volunteered to stick by Glass's side. Historians widely accept that Bridges was the legendary Jim Bridger. It wasn't long, though, before Fitzgerald simply told Bridges it isn't worth sticking around in case the Arikara warriors return, and he took off with Glass's supplies, including his gun. Hugh Glass would ultimately go on to survive the ordeal, before chasing down the teenager called Bridges at Fort Henry and warning him not to turn his back on his fellow man. Needless to say, Bridges took the advice to heart. In 1824, Bridger took part in an expedition further west, into a territory that constitutes present-day Utah. Here, the famed mountain man became the first English-speaking white man to feast his eyes upon Great Salt Lake. At first, Bridger assumed he'd stumbled upon the Pacific Ocean after traversing the countryside by bullboat. The water was so salty, surely it must have been the coastline. It was only after the fact did he learn the lake was simply a massive body of inland water, albeit with a high salinity. As a result of Bridger's discovery for the white population, the region boomed with trading posts and a torrential influx of both American and Canadian fur traders. The 1830s saw the biggest increase in Utah transplants, and the state's history would be forever changed, all thanks to Jim Bridger. Around the same time as his Great Salt Lake revelation, Bridger and the boys at the Rocky Mountain Fur Company were also some of the initial white explorers to happen upon present-day Yellowstone National Park. They wandered upon the geysers and foliage and unmatched views that have since become the stuff of legends. It's hard to fathom how that must have felt 200 years ago, looking over Yellowstone for the very first time. After another 20 years or so, canvassing the frontier and exploring the lands of Idaho and Colorado and the boundaries of New Mexico, Bridger made his next major mark in modern-day Wyoming. Along with his fellow fur trader and mountain man, Luis Vasquez, the two men established Fort Bridger in 1843, nestled right off the Black's Fork of the Green River. The post was perfectly positioned along the Oregon Trail, where anyone and everyone braving the westward migration could take a pit stop and learn from the now wizened-up frontiersmen. With Bridger's incomparable resume, filled with countless trapping, hunting, exploring, and trailblazing expertise, nary a soul traveling the Oregon wouldn't be better off asking for old Gabe's help. At Fort Bridger, Jim would give advice on traveling westward, sporting a detailed knowledge of the trails and bends along the way. He'd assess their wagons, stock, and make recommendations if the party seemed unfit to finish their journey. However, not all of Bridger's wisdom was perfectly attuned to reality. This was none more apparent than in 1846, when the ill-fated Donner Party stopped at Fort Bridger before the next leg in their excursion. It was at the fort that both Bridger and Vasquez confirmed to George Donner and James Reed that the shortcut proposed by explorer Lansford Hastings would be fine to utilize. According to Bridger, the Hastings cutoff was a fine level road and came adorned with plenty of water and grass. He did warn the Donner Party about the stretch of trail prior to the cutoff, which was, according to the frontiersmen, a 40-mile stretch of trail barren of water or foliage. Unfortunately for the wagon train, those 40 miles were actually 80 miles, and the trail certainly wasn't evened and easygoing. As a result, the Donner Reed party became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountain range in the thick of winter, and the rest is tragically left to history. A few years later, in 1850, Bridger carved out his own Oregon Trail shortcut. During his time guiding the Stansbury expedition, consisting of the country's most respected topographical engineers, he discovered an overland route by bypassing South Pass and shortening the trail overall by 60 miles. Located in the south-central region of present-day Wyoming, the shortcut would later be named in his honor, the Bridger Pass. This pass would ultimately be the deciding route to dissect the Continental Divide, used by legendary entities such as the Union Pacific Railroad, the Pony Express, the Overland Stage, and the construction of Interstate 80 in the 20th century. Miners and prospectors alike received similar fortune by way of Bridger's trailblazing prowess, when the Bridger Trail was established 14 years later. The Bozeman Trail, used by gold seekers from Wyoming into Montana, was long considered dense and dangerous. To save the neck of many mining parties, Bridger carved out his alternate route, connecting the goldfields of Montana to Wyoming in a much more safe manner. His prize? He was awarded the title of Chief of Scouts during the notorious Powder River Expedition in 1865, which utilized the Bridger Trail. The year Bridger etched his pass into the folklore of the Oregon Trail, he also married his third and final wife. He married his first wife, a woman named Emma of the Flathead tribe, in 1835. Together they bore 3 children. However, Emma tragically died 11 years later due to fever. Shortly thereafter, he married another Native woman, the daughter of a Ute chief. She also died prematurely, this time in childbirth, just 3 years after their wedding. Then, in 1850, Bridger met Mary Washakie, the daughter of the legendary Shoshone chief Washakie. They had 2 children together. However, like Bridger's previous offspring, most of them met perilous fates. Bridger's eldest, Mary Ann, was captured by Cayuse raiders during the infamous Whitman Massacre and died upon her release from imprisonment. His son Felix, a soldier of the Missouri Artillery, died at an early age from disease. And Josephine, one of Honest Jim Baker's early lovers, died from an illness as well. Virginia Bridger eventually became her father's sole surviving child. Nonetheless, Jim Bridger carried on with platinum perseverance. Throughout the 1850s, he spent most of his time employed as a guide for both independent expeditions and for the United States Army in countless conflicts. The biggest of which was the Utah War, a conflict primarily between the U.S. government and the Mormon settlers in the Utah Territory. It arose from tensions over governance, federal authority, and religious autonomy, ultimately leading to a military confrontation between 1857 and 58. Bridger's involvement, however, came long before the first bullet was fired. It was 1847 when the first Mormon settlers arrived in Utah, right on the frontiersmen's original stomping grounds. The story goes that Bridger and Brigham Young weren't too fond of one another, and their personal bickering planted the seeds of a greater tension amongst the rest of the Mormon traveling party. Eventually, Young and company packed up and left Bridger's domain, but the lingering agitation failed to dissipate. Additional parties of Mormon transplants flooded the region, and Bridger's temper flared as a result. In 1853, the animosity was at an all-time high, and the Mormons put their foot down with growing authority. They dispatched their militia to Fort Bridger in an attempt to arrest Bridger, but old Gabe couldn't be silenced that easily. He fled in the thick of night, leaving nothing but his stash of alcohol behind. The Mormons, flustered and frustrated by the frontiersmen, destroyed the booze, partly because of their religious beliefs, partly because they assumed Bridger had been running a racket with the local natives. Bridger, livid about his untimely departure, attempted to gain the support of then U.S. President James Buchanan. The feds wanted no part of Bridger's quest of vengeance, but it was only a matter of time before they were duped into it anyway. Not long after, the Mormon government made it apparent they had no intentions of assimilating with the United States government at large. But taking no for an answer was never in the cards, and the U.S. military formed an expedition, starting at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to march into Utah and force the Mormons' hands. And who better than to volunteer as guide and chief of scouts for the U.S. than Jim Bridger himself? The lead officer, Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, took no issue with Bridger's offer. And one of his scouts, a young fledgling by the name of William Frederick Cody, saw Bridger as a larger-than-life figure, a legend who'd mold the mind of the boy that would eventually become Buffalo Bill. Unfortunately for everyone, the first leg of the expedition was dreadful. Disease ran rampant in the winter of '57, and the troops fell to sickness more often than gunfire. Bridger was equally dismayed when they marched into Fort Bridger, only to find it reduced to a pile of ash and embers. The Mormons had retreated, but not before striking the final blow to Bridger's brightest venture. In the end, Bridger and company had the last laugh, as the Great Salt Lake Rebellion was subdued and the Mormon government was absorbed by the feds. While Bridger failed to collect insurance from the United States for his losses at the Fort Bridger trading post, he swallowed his pride and moved on to the next adventure. In 1859, the Reynolds Expedition, a mapping quest bound for the headwaters of the Yellowstone River, employed Bridger as their chief guide, thanks to his previous exploits trekking through Yellowstone. Unfortunately, Captain William Reynolds and company never made it that far, due to extreme snowfall levels en route. However, Bridger was able to aid the expedition in exploring both Pierre's Hole and Jackson Hole in present-day Idaho. One of the major reasons why Bridger was so valuable as a scout to the U.S. Army was his encyclopedic knowledge of indigenous cultures, languages, and tendencies. Early on in life, he made it his mission to gain respect from the local tribes, to both create alliances and learn about their ways of life. It's why all three of his wives were of an indigenous race, and why he navigated the tensions of settler-native relations during his fur trading days with ease. He was on good terms with any war chief or tribal elder who reciprocated. However, by the end of the 1860s, U.S. and Native American relations were degraded beyond repair. As a result of the Bozeman Trail, the U.S. Army was looking to establish a series of forts to supplement their efforts, and Bridger was seen as the perfect chief of scouts for the endeavor. The only problem? The Bozeman Trail was now splitting straight through the ancestral hunting grounds of the Lakota natives, and Lakota warriors were having none of it. But with the bountiful gold pouring out of Montana Territory, the U.S. couldn't care less about the Lakotas' concerns, and General William Tecumseh Sherman, along with Bridger and Colonel Henry B. Carrington right by his side, erected 3 forts on the trail to satisfy the gold rush. But when 700 U.S. soldiers showed up to Fort Laramie, Red Cloud, a Lakota war chief, let the cavalry know that the Lakota wouldn't simply stand by to watch the development of the Bozeman Trail continue deplenishing their resources. Carrington and Bridger both felt something was amiss, and the aforementioned Jim Beckworth, Bridger's peer and mountain man compatriot, confirmed their fears. He warned them major conflict with the Lakota was on the horizon, but the U.S. did little to heed caution. Fort Reno, Fort C.F. Smith, and Fort Phil Kearny were built as planned, and Red Cloud's final straw had fallen. In 1866, Bridger was kept on by Colonel Carrington, who was in search of bona fide scouts to lead his offensive during Red Cloud's war. Bridger accepted, and he was stationed at Fort Phil Kearny during the war's major conflicts, such as the Fetterman Fight in '66 and the Wagon Box Fight in '67. By 1868, Jim Bridger had reached his breaking point. The frontier turned Wild West had finally broken the seemingly unbreakable. Dealing with blindness, arthritis, goiter, and rheumatism, Bridger headed back east, back to his roots in rural Missouri. He settled on a farm near Westport, a present-day suburb of Kansas City. Beyond his survivalist acumen and overall domination of frontier exploration, Jim Bridger also became much of a folk hero himself, known for his tall tales and fables of Old West lore. Most of these half-truths and folk tales centered on his journeys through Yellowstone, a real place that Bridger enchanted with whispers of marvels and mysteries. One such story went that Yellowstone was filled with a special type of clear glass that could distort humans' perception of wildlife. Bridger recalled a time he spent hunting a bull elk near Obsidian Cliff, where this game wasn't reacting to any of the shots fired by the expert hunter. Bridger said he fired round after round, yet the elk simply stood still, unbothered by imminent danger. According to Bridger, he eventually gave in to the uncanny behavior and crept up on the elk. However, when he raised his hunting rifle to strike the bull, it only made an impact with what he called a mountain of clear glass. He said this glass was unbreakable, and if one were to look through it, the glass acted as a lens, making a distant object appear much closer, even if it was multiple miles afar. Another famous Bridgerism revolved around a species of exotic birds that apparently called Yellowstone home. According to the frontiersman, deep within Yellowstone was a petrified forest filled with petrified birds that sang petrified songs. What this meant was any willing listener's best guess. Such a petrified woodland, home to petrified fowl, has never been observed before or since. Of course, genuinely curious folk would continue asking Bridger questions regardless if he twisted the truth or not. A popular inquiry was his diet while adventuring across Yellowstone. The trapper would often shrug and talk about the bountiful trout that filled a specific lake in the heart of the region. The lake was supposedly cold underneath, with a layer of much warmer water simmering on the surface, all thanks to the confluence of a hot spring located nearby. Bridger explained that if he needed food, he'd simply cast his line, snag a trout in this mystical lake, and intentionally reel it in slowly and methodically. This way, the hot waters up top would cook the trout before it broke the surface. While there are both hot springs and trout populations in close proximity in Yellowstone, this isn't necessarily a tried and true method. Maybe the most fabled of all of Jim Bridger's fables was his flat-faced mountain alarm clock. According to the frontiersman, his campsite of choice sat on a valley floor, with a massive flat-faced mountainside overlooking his post. Bridger said it was so far away, yet so gargantuan, that if he shouted in the general direction of the rocky facade, he wouldn't hear the echo of his own voice for 6 hours. Thus, to ensure he was up in time for the next day's adventures, Bridger would scream, "Time to get up," at the flat-faced mountain, fall into a slumber, then wake up at the crack of dawn to the sound of his own voice reverberating through the crisp Yellowstone air. For as rugged and hardened as a man as Jim Bridger was, his creativity held no bounds. Only a true legend could fill in folklore of such size. In the end, Bridger was cared for by his only surviving child, Virginia Bridger, for 13 years until his death in 1881. Having lived a life that spanned a bulk of the 19th century, Bridger died a man of many memories, countless stories, and a heart and soul that both shaped and was defined by the American frontier. The aforementioned Grenville Dodge, who in 1903 moved Bridger's remains to the Mount Washington Forever Cemetery in Independence, Missouri, once stated the following about Jim Bridger. Jim was a very companionable man. In person, he was over 6 feet tall, spare, straight as an arrow, agile, raw-boned, and of a powerful frame. Eyes gray, hair brown, and abundant even in old age. Expression mild, and manners agreeable. He was hospitable and generous, and was always trusted and respected. We couldn't say it better ourselves.